You're told it your entire life. Buy a house. Build equity. Stop throwing money away on rent. Real adults own homes. The messaging is relentless. From parents, from culture, from every financial advisor who has ever spoken about wealth building. Renting is throwing money away. Owning is building wealth. It sounds so obvious that questioning it feels almost rebellious. But for Gen Z, for people entering the housing market now, in an environment fundamentally different from the one their parents bought, into this advice might be the single most expensive piece of guidance they'll ever receive. Not because homeownership is always wrong, but because the homeownership equation has changed so dramatically that the assumption underlying the advice that buying is always better than renting is no longer true in most major markets. Today, we're going to look at what's actually happening in the housing market, what it costs to own now versus what it cost when your parents bought, and why the math that used to work has stopped working for most people trying to buy their first home. The rent versus own equation that has shifted. Let's start with the most basic calculation, the price-to-rent ratio. This is the price of a home divided by its annual rental value. If a house costs $500,000 and rents for $2,000 per month, the annual rent is $24,000. The price-to-rent ratio is roughly 21. Historically, price-to-rent ratios between 12 and 16 were considered fair, the point where buying and renting produced similar long-term wealth outcomes. Below 16, buying was advantageous. Above 16, renting was advantageous. In most major U.S. cities right now, price-to-rent ratios are in the 25 to 35 range. In some expensive markets, they exceed 50. This means the cost to buy has diverged dramatically from the cost to rent. A home that costs $600,000 might rent for $2,000 per month. You're paying 300,000 times the annual rent for the purchase price. At a 3.5% mortgage rate, the monthly housing cost is around $3,200, but rent is only $2,000. So you're paying $1,200 more per month to own than to rent the equivalent property. The old equation, owning builds equity. Renting throws money away, assumed a world where owning wasn't dramatically more expensive than renting. That world no longer exists in most major markets. The real cost of ownership at current prices. Let's trace through what actually happens when someone buys a home at current prices. Purchase price, $600,000. Down payment at 20%, $120,000. Mortgage, $480,000 at 6% over 30 years. Monthly mortgage payment, approximately $2,880.
Property tax in most states, roughly 1 to 1.2% of value annually on $600,000. That's $6,000 to $7,000 per year, or $500 to $600 monthly. Homeowners insurance, roughly $1,000 to $1,500 annually, or roughly $100 monthly. HOA fees, if applicable, could be zero, could be several hundred monthly.
Maintenance, 1 to 2% of property value annually. On $600,000, that's $6,000 to $12,000 per year, $500 to $1,000 monthly. Utilities for a single-family home, $200 to $400 monthly depending on climate. Total monthly housing cost, roughly $4,000 to $4,500 monthly. Now compare to renting the same property, $2,000 to $2,200 monthly. The difference is roughly $2,000 monthly, $24,000 annually. Over 30 years, that's $720,000 more spent on owned housing than on rented equivalent. For that $720,000 premium, what do you actually get? Appreciation. If the house appreciates at 3% annually for 30 years, it's worth roughly $1.6 million. You've gained $1 million on a $600,000 purchase, but you've spent $720,000 more on ownership costs than you would have on rent. The net wealth gain is $280,000 after accounting for the higher ownership costs. Now subtract closing costs, $12,000. real estate agent commission on sale roughly $36,000, and the opportunity cost of the $120,000 down payment invested at 7% for 30 years roughly $1.2 million. The actual wealth outcome from buying at current prices and holding 30 years is net negative when compared to renting and investing, the cost differential. The down payment opportunity cost that destroys the math. Here's the piece that changes everything for Gen Z but that nobody emphasizes. The down payment $120,000 is capital that could be deployed elsewhere. If you didn't buy a home, you'd have that $120,000 to invest. At 7% annual returns over 30 years, that $120,000 becomes approximately $1.3 million. Just the down payment, compounding, growing. Meanwhile, you're renting. You're paying $2,000 monthly instead of $4,500 monthly. That $2,500 difference monthly you're investing. Over 30 years, $2,500 monthly invested at 7% returns becomes roughly $2.7 million. So you have $1.3 million from the down payment investment, $2.7 million from the monthly rent differential invested, total $4 million. The homeowner has $1 million in appreciated house value, minus $720,000 in extra ownership costs paid over the life of the loan, minus closing and agent costs. Net, roughly $280,000. The renter who invested the down payment and the monthly rent differential has $4 million. The owner has $280,000. That's a 4-to-1 difference in wealth accumulation. And the difference comes not from owning being bad. It comes from the price-to-rent ratio being so high that owning is economically irrational compared to renting and investing. The emotion versus the math. Here's the disconnect that makes this hard to accept. Owning a home feels like wealth building. It feels solid. It feels like you're doing the responsible adult thing. The emotional satisfaction is real. The sense of ownership is real. The stability of not having a landlord is real. But the financial outcome is worse than renting and investing in every major metric. This creates cognitive dissonance. People feel like they should own. The culture says they should own. But the math says it's a bad financial decision. So what people do is compartmentalize. They accept the emotional benefit as worth the financial cost. They buy anyway. And then they spend the next 30 years in a house they can't easily afford. Watching other people build more wealth by doing the financially rational thing and justifying the decision through emotional rather than financial reasoning. This is not a character judgment. It's a description of what's happening in the market. The people getting wealthy are the ones who decoupled the emotional appeal of homeownership from the financial reality of it. When buying actually makes sense. This is not an argument that nobody should ever buy a home. There are scenarios where buying is the right financial decision, when the price-to-rent ratio is actually reasonable. In markets where price-to-rent is below 16, buying can make financial sense. These markets are rare now, they exist, but not in the expensive coastal cities where most Gen Z is trying to buy. When you plan to stay for 10+ years, the transaction costs of buying and selling are significant. If you're going to move in 5 years, the costs of buying and selling exceed the benefits of appreciation. If you plan to stay longer, the math improves. When you have an unusual advantage, access to below-market purchases, inherited property, a market where you have special knowledge or ability to find deals. These change the equation. When the non-financial benefits are worth the financial cost, you genuinely value the stability, the neighborhood, the school system, and you acknowledge that you're paying a financial premium for these things and you're okay with that. The problem is not buying in these scenarios. The problem is buying in expensive markets at expensive prices without acknowledging the actual financial cost. What Gen Z should actually do. If you're Gen Z trying to navigate housing decisions, Here's what the math suggests. First, calculate the actual price-to-rent ratio in your market. Home price divided by annual rent for equivalent property. If it's above 18, owning is likely financially worse than renting and investing. Second, if the ratio is unfavorable, rent. Don't feel guilty about it. Don't let the cultural narrative about adulting and homeownership push you into a bad financial decision. Rent. Invest the down payment money you would have spent. Invest the monthly cost differential. Third, build wealth through other means. Career development, skill building. Investing the capital you're not deploying into expensive housing. If you follow this path, renting in expensive markets, investing aggressively, building career income by your 40s, you have the option to buy if you want to. You have 4 times the wealth you would have had if you bought young in an expensive market. Fourth, only buy when the equation makes sense, when the price-to-rent ratio is reasonable, when you're planning to stay long-term, when you have genuine economic advantage. The generational wealth transfer that's happening. Here's what's actually happening in real time. Gen X and older generations bought homes when price-to-rent ratios were reasonable, 12 to 16 range. They bought into appreciating markets and paid reasonable premiums. Those homes appreciate. They extract equity. They build wealth through real estate. Gen Z is being told to buy in the same way, but the economics have completely changed. Gen Z buys at price-to-rent ratios of 25 to 35. They pay enormous premiums. They extract the down payment money they could have invested. They spend 30 years paying elevated housing costs. By the time Gen Z has finished paying off their homes, the generational wealth gap created by buying in different markets with different economics is enormous. The generation that bought when it made sense got wealthier. The generation that bought because they were told to buy got poorer. This is not inevitable. It's the result of different financial decisions made under different market conditions. Your parents could buy a house for 3 times their annual salary, pay it off in 15 years, and build enormous wealth. You're being told to buy a house for 8 to 10 times your annual salary, pay it off in 30 years, at housing costs that consume half your income. The math is not comparable. The advice that made sense then makes less sense now. This doesn't mean never buy. It means evaluate the actual price-to-rent ratio. It means acknowledge the real financial cost. It means understand the opportunity cost of the down payment. And it means if the math doesn't work, if you're in an expensive market where renting is cheaper, then owning by a significant margin, make the financially rational decision. Rent. Invest, build wealth through means other than real estate in expensive markets. The culture will tell you that owning is what real adults do. But what real adults do is run the math and make decisions based on actual financial outcomes, not on cultural narratives. That's the difference between building wealth and being trapped by it.